Imagine a time when the world was dominated by an empire so vast and powerful that its reach stretched from the icy steppes of Mongolia to the sun-kissed plains of Europe. This was the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire in history, feared by all who knew its name. Its armies, under the ruthless leadership of Genghis Khan and later his descendants, swept through cities and kingdoms, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. No region seemed safe from their might, and no force appeared capable of standing in their way. Yet in the heart of Southeast Asia, a kingdom stood defiant, its people unwilling to bow before the Mongol juggernaut. This kingdom was Dai Viet, the land we now know as Vietnam. By the late 13th century, the Mongols had conquered vast swaths of Eurasia. Their influence was not only military, but cultural, economic, and political, as they imposed their authority over vast territories. The Mongol Empire's expansion seemed unstoppable, and the idea of resisting them was unthinkable for many smaller kingdoms. But one nation, small in comparison to the giants of the time, would challenge this notion. Dai Viet, located along the Red River Delta in modern-day Vietnam, stood on the precipice of annihilation. The Mongols, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, had set their sights on the kingdom, seeing it as a key strategic point in their broader ambitions to control Southeast Asia and expand their empire even further. The first invasion came in 1258. At that time, Dai Viet was a kingdom with a proud history and a deeply rooted cultural identity. But it was not prepared for the Mongol onslaught. The Mongol army, equipped with superior technology, including the infamous Mongol cavalry and siege engines, easily overwhelmed the initial defenses of Dai Viet. Thang Long, the kingdom's capital, modern-day Hanoi, fell into Mongol hands. The city was occupied, and its rulers were forced to submit. But this submission was not to last long. The Vietnamese, driven by a deep sense of national pride and the desire to protect their way of life, refused to remain under Mongol control. The Mongol forces, despite their advanced military tactics, faced a foe unlike any they had encountered before. What the Mongols underestimated was the strength of the Vietnamese people's will. The Mongols, though masters of open field warfare and sieges, were unfamiliar with the dense jungles, rivers, and mountains that covered the land of Dai Viet. The Vietnamese, led by General Tran Hung Dao, fought not just with weapons but with knowledge of their land. They fought from the shadows, using guerrilla tactics, hit and run attacks, and ambushes that rendered the Mongol army's superior numbers useless. The jungles and rivers of Vietnam became their allies as they launched surprise attacks on Mongol forces, slowly wearing them down. But it was not just military strategy that turned the tide. The Vietnamese people, from peasants to nobles, united in their resistance against the foreign invader. This unity, along with their unwavering determination, became the backbone of their struggle. As the years went on, the Mongol Empire's campaign against Dai Viet became more and more difficult, not just due to the terrain, but also because of the Vietnamese people's ingenuity and persistence. The Mongol invaders, despite their might, were bogged down in endless skirmishes, their supply lines stretched thin, and their morale dwindling. The story of Vietnam's resistance against the Mongols is not just one of military strategy, but of resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story of how a small kingdom, with limited resources and a fraction of the Mongol army's numbers, managed to stand firm against an empire that had already conquered much of the known world. The Vietnamese, against all expectations, fought back with everything they had. Their weapons may have been crude compared to the Mongols' sophisticated arsenal, but their spirit was unbreakable. Perhaps the most decisive moment in this epic struggle came in 1288 at the Battle of Bach River. This was a battle that would go down in history as one of the most brilliant military victories ever achieved against the Mongols. It was not fought with the same tactics that had worked before. This time, the Vietnamese used the environment to their advantage in a way that completely outwitted the Mongol forces. General Tran Hung Dao, leading his troops, ordered the construction of underwater stakes in the river, which would become the Mongols' undoing. As the Mongol fleet advanced up the river, the tide came in, trapping them against the spikes. The Vietnamese forces then struck, causing the Mongol fleet to be decimated. The Mongols, with their superior numbers and technology, were left helpless, and this defeat marked the end of the Mongol attempts to conquer Dai Viet. This victory, more than just a military success, became a symbol of Vietnamese resilience. It was a clear message to the world that even the mightiest empires could be defeated, not by sheer strength alone, but by intelligence, unity, and an unyielding determination to protect one's homeland. The story of Vietnam's resistance against the Mongols is a reminder that the true strength of a nation lies not just in its armies, but in the hearts of its people. The Mongol Empire, despite its vast power, was not invincible, and the victory of Dai Viet became an enduring testament to the power of resistance and national pride. It was a victory that would echo throughout history, inspiring future generations to stand firm in the face of adversity. This is the story of how a small kingdom, surrounded by the greatest empire of its time, stood tall and drove the Mongols back, securing its place in history as one of the greatest examples of resilience and courage. It is a story that proves no matter how large or small, any nation can defend its sovereignty when its people stand united. And, in the case of Vietnam, it was a story that would be told for centuries, a tale of a people who refused to be crushed beneath the weight of an empire's might. In the 1250s, the Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan's descendants, had already achieved the unimaginable. It had expanded its reach from the cold, vast steppes of Mongolia to the warm, bustling cities of Europe and China. The empire's military might was unmatched, its conquests sweeping across the land like an unstoppable storm. The Mongols, masters of cavalry, siege tactics, and psychological warfare, conquered all that stood before them, imposing their will on kingdoms and empires, forcing them into submission or obliterating them entirely. From the mountains of Persia to the vast plains of Russia, the Mongols dominated every battlefield. By 1259, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, had firmly positioned himself as the leader of the Mongol Empire. He had grand ambitions to extend the reach of the Mongols even further, to the furthest corners of the earth. But there was one kingdom that stood firmly in his way, one land that defied Mongol expectations. This land was the kingdom of Dai Viet, which lay between the Mongol ambitions to conquer the Song dynasty of southern China and the expansive territories the Mongols had already conquered. To Kublai Khan, the kingdom of Dai Viet was more than just another small, inconsequential land. It was a strategic barrier, a key piece of territory that stood between his forces and the ultimate control of Southeast Asia. If Kublai could secure Dai Viet, the rest of Southeast Asia, including the kingdom of Champa and the Song dynasty, would be within his reach. The Mongols' incredible ability to crush any opposition had already been proven in the north and west. But Dai Viet remained a puzzle, a kingdom that, while small in comparison to the vast Mongol Empire, was uniquely positioned and fiercely independent. Kublai Khan's gaze turned toward the Red River Delta, the fertile heartland of Dai Viet. He recognized that controlling this region would open the door to further Mongol expansion into the southern territories of China. He also believed that conquering Dai Viet would secure vital trade routes through the region, which were crucial for Mongol access to the wealth of the Indian Ocean and beyond. The Mongols had set their sights on this tiny kingdom, but they did not understand what lay ahead. What they did not anticipate was the fierce resilience of the Vietnamese people and their unwillingness to submit to a foreign conqueror. At the time, the Vietnamese were a people with a long history of fighting for their autonomy. The kingdom of Dai Viet had been founded centuries earlier, carved out of the dense jungles and valleys of the Red River Delta. Its people were survivors, a resilient and resourceful society that had learned to live in harmony with their challenging environment. The Vietnamese were skilled farmers, traders, and warriors, adept at navigating the rugged landscapes and waterways that defined their land. Their kingdom had endured previous invasions and emerged victorious, their identity forged through centuries of resistance. And now, as the Mongols began their campaign in the region, the Vietnamese found themselves facing an unprecedented challenge. Yet, they were far from intimidated. Kublai Khan dispatched his forces with a sense of confidence. The Mongol army, a powerful and highly disciplined force, advanced toward the Vietnamese capital of Thang Long, modern-day Hanoi. The Mongols had crushed empires larger than Dai Viet, and they believed that this would be no different. They believed they would sweep through the land like they had elsewhere. However, what they soon discovered was that the terrain of Dai Viet was unlike anything they had encountered before. The thick jungles, swift rivers, and towering mountains that stretched across the kingdom were not just obstacles. They were advantages for the Vietnamese defenders. General Tran Hung Dao, a brilliant military strategist and the leader of the Vietnamese resistance, quickly recognized the limitations of the Mongol army. While the Mongols excelled in open field combat, their strength was also their weakness. Their reliance on cavalry and massive, organized formations was not suited for the dense Vietnamese terrain. Tran Hung Dao used this to his advantage, employing guerrilla tactics that struck swiftly and then disappeared into the forests, disrupting the Mongols at every turn. The Vietnamese forces used their superior knowledge of the land to launch ambushes, attack Mongol supply lines, and engage in surprise raids. The Mongols, unfamiliar with the environment and unable to fully adapt to the jungle warfare, found themselves at a disadvantage. As the Mongol army advanced toward Thang Long, the Vietnamese knew they needed a bold strategy to turn the tide of the war. Tran Hung Dao's brilliance as a strategist became clear in the coming months. Rather than engaging the Mongols directly in pitched battles, he set traps, lured the enemy into vulnerable positions, and used the natural environment as a weapon. The Mongol forces, stretched thin and unable to effectively engage in their traditional tactics, began to falter. The Vietnamese people rallied behind their leaders, and their resolve grew stronger with each victory. The Mongols, for all their might, could not adapt to the unconventional warfare being waged against them. As the months went by, the Vietnamese successfully pushed back Mongol forces, inflicting heavy losses. With each Mongol defeat, the Vietnamese grew more confident, and the Mongol Empire began to realize that this would not be an easy conquest. Kublai Khan, accustomed to quick victories, faced an unexpected challenge that would test his empire's military strategy and leadership. But Kublai Khan was not one to back down easily. Determined to subdue Dai Viet, he decided to escalate his campaign. sending even larger forces to crush the resistance. However, the Vietnamese were ready. They had learned from their initial encounters and devised an even more ingenious plan to deal a devastating blow to the Mongol forces. By 1288, the Mongol Empire would learn a lesson they would never forget. The Vietnamese, having studied the Mongol tactics and weaknesses in detail, devised a brilliant strategy at the Battle of Bach River. As the Mongol fleet approached, the Vietnamese forces prepared to ambush them, using the river's natural geography to their advantage. They planted sharp, iron-tipped stakes under the water surface, concealed from the Mongol forces. As the tide rose, the Mongol ships sailed directly into the trap, impaled on the stakes. The Vietnamese forces struck with precision, decimating the Mongol fleet and delivering a crushing blow to the once unstoppable army. The Mongol forces, unable to adapt to the clever Vietnamese strategy, were forced to retreat in disarray. The defeat at Bach River marked the end of Mongol ambitions in Southeast Asia, as Kublai Khan's empire recognized that they had met their match in the Vietnamese. What began as a confident invasion turned into a humiliating withdrawal, and Dai Viet remained unconquered, its people standing tall against the might of the Mongol Empire. The story of Dai Viet's resistance against the Mongols is a tale of incredible resilience, courage, and strategy. It was a battle fought not just on the fields of war, but in the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, who refused to be subjugated. And in the end, it was the very thing the Mongols underestimated the Vietnamese people's fierce determination to protect their homeland that led to their defeat. In 1258, Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler, launched a large-scale invasion of Dai Viet with the hope of asserting control over the kingdom and solidifying his dominance in Southeast Asia. With his empire's mighty forces at his disposal, he believed that the Vietnamese, despite their proud history and resistance, would be no match for the Mongol war machine. The Mongols were known for their unmatched cavalry, advanced siege weapons, and overwhelming numbers. Their reputation as conquerors who had subdued vast empires from the Middle East to China preceded them. It seemed inevitable that Dai Viet would soon fall under Mongol rule. The Mongols quickly advanced and captured Thang Long, the capital of Dai Viet, which is now modern-day Hanoi. For a moment, it seemed that victory was within Kublai Khan's grasp. However, what the Mongols did not anticipate was the tenacity and resilience of the Vietnamese people, and more importantly, their intimate knowledge of the terrain. Though the Mongols had seized the city, they were soon to realize that controlling the capital was not the same as conquering the kingdom. The Vietnamese people, under the leadership of their fearless generals, quickly began to organize their resistance. Unlike the open plains of Central Asia, where Mongol cavalry dominated, Dai Viet was a land of dense forests, winding rivers, and rugged mountains. This unfamiliar terrain would become the Vietnamese people's greatest weapon. The Mongols, so accustomed to fast-moving cavalry battles on wide, flat landscapes, were unprepared for the guerrilla warfare they were about to face. The Vietnamese, experts in navigating the jungles and hills, launched surprise attacks that sent the Mongols reeling. General Tran Hung Dao, one of the most brilliant military minds in Vietnamese history, was a master of this type of warfare. Understanding the advantages that the terrain offered, Tran utilized the dense jungles and mountain passes to mount guerrilla attacks that would harass and weaken the Mongol forces. His strategy was simple but effective: hit fast and retreat before the enemy could retaliate. He knew that the Mongols relied on their speed and cavalry to dominate the battlefield, So he focused on wearing them down by forcing them into prolonged engagements in an environment that did not favor their tactics. As the months passed, the Mongols began to realize the challenges they faced. Their supply lines were increasingly vulnerable to attack, and the constant skirmishes took a toll on their morale. The Vietnamese warriors, though fewer in number, were fighting for their homeland, and their resolve was unbreakable. They knew the Mongols were powerful, but they also understood that they could not afford to allow their capital to fall without a fight. The Vietnamese resistance grew stronger with every passing day, and the Mongol forces, once so sure of their victory, found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition they had not anticipated. Despite the Mongols' superior weapons and greater numbers, they were at a disadvantage in this unfamiliar landscape. Mongol tactics that had been successful in vast, open fields proved useless in the jungles of Vietnam. The Vietnamese used the land itself as an ally. The river systems, the thick jungles, and the mountainous regions provided them with the perfect opportunity to launch lightning-fast strikes. The Mongols, who relied heavily on their cavalry and siege warfare, struggled to adapt to the irregular tactics that the Vietnamese employed so effectively. The Mongols' attempt to hold Thang Long was short-lived. As the resistance mounted, the Vietnamese managed to regain control of the capital and push the invaders back. Kublai Khan, though still determined, found that his forces were unable to maintain control of the territory they had initially seized. The Mongol forces were spread thin, and their once unbreakable momentum began to waver. One of the most significant advantages the Vietnamese held was their unity. Despite the Mongol forces being vastly superior in size and strength, the Vietnamese people were united in their determination to protect their homeland. Every man, woman, and child played a part in resisting the invaders, whether it was by providing food and supplies to the soldiers or by supporting the warriors in the field. This sense of unity, forged through centuries of hardship and resistance, became the backbone of their resistance efforts. As the Vietnamese continued their campaign of resistance, they were able to wear down the Mongol forces, pushing them out of Thang Long and reclaiming control over their kingdom. The Mongols, who had thought the conquest of Dai Viet would be easy, found themselves facing a foe they had not anticipated, a determined and resourceful people who knew their land better than the Mongols ever could. The brief Mongol occupation of Thang Long in 1258 ended in failure. The Mongols, despite their overwhelming power and technological advantages, could not sustain control over the kingdom due to the fierce resistance and superior knowledge of the terrain that the Vietnamese forces brought to bear. The Vietnamese, with their expert use of guerrilla tactics and their unyielding will to defend their homeland, succeeded in pushing the Mongols back and retaking their capital. This victory, while not the end of the Mongol threat, sent a clear message to Kublai Khan and the Mongol Empire. The Vietnamese were not like the other kingdoms they had conquered. They were a people who would fight to the last man to defend their land, and they would not be easily subjugated. What had started as a Mongol conquest of Dai Viet turned into a humiliating retreat. The Mongols, accustomed to quick victories and swift dominance, had underestimated the Vietnamese people's resilience, and the fierce and determined resistance they mounted left the Mongols in awe. Though the Mongols would return to Vietnam in the coming decades, their initial failure to conquer the kingdom was a defining moment in the history of the Mongol Empire. It was a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, is invincible, especially when it underestimates the spirit of a people determined to protect their homeland. The brief occupation of Thang Long was just the beginning of a long and bitter struggle. but it also marked the beginning of Vietnam's epic resistance to Mongol invasion. It proved that no matter how great the enemy, the power of a united people, familiar with their land and committed to their cause, could stand firm and drive away even the most powerful armies in history. The Mongol invasion of Dai Viet in 1258 was supposed to be just another conquest in the Mongol Empire's vast campaign to dominate the known world. The Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, were accustomed to victories that seemed inevitable. They had already swept through Central Asia, China, and Eastern Europe, obliterating any resistance that dared to stand in their way. Dai Viet, a small kingdom nestled in the heart of Southeast Asia, appeared to be yet another easy target. However, as history would soon show, the Vietnamese people were no strangers to resistance, and their resolve would turn the tide in ways the Mongols never expected. The Mongols quickly captured Thang Long, the capital of Dai Viet modern-day Hanoi, in 1258. The city fell easily under their superior military might, and the Vietnamese leadership was forced to retreat. It seemed as though the Mongol Empire's unstoppable war machine had claimed yet another victory. But what the Mongols did not anticipate was the fierce and ingenious resistance they would face, not from a larger, more organized army, but from a people who knew their land better than anyone and were willing to do anything to protect it. One of the most significant turning points in this struggle came with the Battle of Binh Lhen. The Mongols, though technologically advanced, had underestimated the power of the Vietnamese forces and their ability to adapt in the face of a superior enemy. The battle occurred after the Mongols, confident from their success in capturing the capital, advanced deeper into Dai Viet, only to be met with fierce opposition from the Vietnamese army. Emperor Tran Tong, who had led his people in their retreat to the countryside, now took the offensive. Emperor Tran Tong knew that direct confrontation with the Mongols, especially in open terrain, would likely spell disaster for the Vietnamese. The Mongols had an advantage in cavalry and heavy artillery, and any traditional battle on open ground would only play into their hands. However, the Vietnamese were determined to find a way to fight on their terms a battle that would utilize their knowledge of the land, their resilience, and their ingenuity. Tran Tong, who had already proven his prowess as a leader and strategist, decided to use a force that the Mongols had never encountered before in battle war: elephants. The Vietnamese war elephants, though not unique to the region, had been crucial in past conflicts. They were strong, imposing, and could carry heavy armor, making them a formidable force on the battlefield. The Mongols, who had fought against many adversaries, had never faced such a challenge. Their cavalry, which was usually the decisive factor in their victories, was ill-prepared for the massive elephants charging through their ranks. At the Battle of Binh Lhen, Tran Tong's army, bolstered by their war elephants, faced off against the Mongols in a landscape that gave them the upper hand. The terrain in which they fought was familiar to the Vietnamese, but completely foreign to the Mongol forces. The Vietnamese used the narrow, forested areas to their advantage, forcing the Mongols to fight in conditions that neutralized their cavalry's speed and maneuverability. In this dense landscape, the Mongols' traditional fighting style was ineffective, and the war elephants, with their overwhelming power and size, proved to be a game-changer. As the battle unfolded, the Mongols found themselves disoriented. Their superior cavalry, once the epitome of military might, was no match for the sheer force of the war elephants charging through their ranks. The Mongol horsemen, used to their fast-paced hit-and-run tactics, struggled to cope with the massive creatures trampling through their lines, scattering their cavalry and causing confusion within their forces. The Mongol warriors, usually so confident and disciplined, found themselves in chaos, unable to adapt to the ferocity of the Vietnamese tactics. Despite the Mongols' technological superiority, including their advanced siege weapons and archery, the battle was quickly turning in favor of the Vietnamese. The Mongols' reliance on cavalry and their traditional military strategies had proven ineffective in the dense, unforgiving terrain of Dai Viet. The war elephants, along with the Vietnamese forces' knowledge of the environment, created an overwhelming force that the Mongols could not overcome. The Mongol forces were forced to retreat, marking the first significant defeat of their campaign. It was a humiliation for the Mongols, who had never expected such fierce resistance from a relatively small kingdom. The Vietnamese victory at Binh Lên was not just a tactical success. It was a message, one that reverberated throughout the Mongol Empire. It demonstrated that, despite the Mongols' technological advantages, they could be beaten. The Vietnamese had shown that their strength lay not just in their weapons, but in their unity, their adaptability, and their unbreakable will to defend their homeland. The Mongols, realizing that they could not simply overpower the Vietnamese through brute force, began to reconsider their approach. This defeat, though not the end of the Mongol campaign in Dai Viet, marked a significant shift in the way the conflict would unfold. The Mongols were no longer invincible, and the Vietnamese had proven that they could stand their ground against one of the most powerful empires in the world. After the battle, the morale of the Vietnamese forces soared. It was a rare and unexpected victory, one that galvanized their resistance and inspired the people of Dai Viet to continue their fight against the Mongol invaders. The defeat at Binh Lên was a moment of triumph for the Vietnamese, but it was also a moment that would shape the course of history. It was the beginning of a long, hard-fought struggle that would eventually lead to the Mongols' withdrawal from Dai Viet and a reaffirmation of the kingdom's independence. The Battle of Binh Lên became a symbol of Vietnamese resilience. It demonstrated that, with determination, resourcefulness, and a deep connection to their land, the Vietnamese could hold their own against even the most powerful invaders. The use of war elephants, the strategic genius of Emperor Tran Tung, and the courage of the Vietnamese people ensured that Dai Viet would not be easily conquered. Though the Mongols would return with larger forces, the Battle of Binh Lên was a reminder that the Vietnamese resistance was not a fluke. It was the beginning of a resistance that would stand firm against the Mongol Empire for years to come. In the end, the victory at Binh Lên was a crucial moment in the history of Vietnam, one that set the stage for their ultimate triumph over the Mongols. It was a testament to the power of the or else Vietnamese people, who, in the face of overwhelming odds, refused to be crushed under the weight of the Mongol Empire's might. Their determination would go down in history as one of the greatest examples of national resistance against foreign invaders. In 1258, the Mongols had struck swiftly and decisively, capturing the Vietnamese capital Thang Long with overwhelming force. However, what was supposed to be a quick conquest turned into a humiliating retreat for the Mongols, as the Vietnamese, under the brilliant leadership of General Tran Hung Dao, used their superior knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics to drive the invaders out. This unexpected and resounding defeat sent shockwaves through the Mongol Empire, a stark reminder that even the mightiest of forces could be beaten, especially when facing a determined and resourceful adversary. But despite their failure in the first invasion, the Mongols were relentless. They would return to Dai Viet, and in 1285 they brought a much larger, more formidable force. This time, the Mongols were determined to succeed where they had failed before. Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor, dispatched a massive army, far larger than the one that had invaded in 1258. to ensure the conquest of Dai Viet. Their forces were bolstered by experienced soldiers, siege equipment, and an array of resources drawn from across the vast Mongol Empire. The Mongols, now even more confident, were certain that they could overwhelm the Vietnamese and crush their resistance once and for all. But what they did not anticipate was that the same force that had repelled them years earlier, General Tran Hung Dao, was still at the helm, and his strategies had only grown more refined. The Vietnamese knew that this second invasion would be a much larger and more dangerous threat, but they were not intimidated. Tran Hung Dao, who had become a legendary figure in Vietnamese military history after the first Mongol invasion, was well aware of the scale of the challenge ahead. However, he also understood that the Mongol success relied heavily on their ability to dominate open ground with their cavalry and siege weapons. The terrain of Dai Viet, with its dense jungles, winding rivers, and treacherous mountains, was still a formidable advantage for the Vietnamese. This time, however, Tran Hung Dao had a deeper understanding of how to use those advantages in combination with new tactics. The Mongols, still accustomed to their sweeping victories across vast open plains, were unprepared for the guerrilla warfare that Tran Hung Dao and his forces had perfected. The Vietnamese utilized their knowledge of the terrain to set traps and ambushes that were devastating to the Mongol forces. Tran's strategy was built on the principle of deception and disruption. Instead of facing the Mongols in a direct battle, where the Vietnamese would undoubtedly be outnumbered and outclassed, he opted for a strategy of harassment. His forces launched small but frequent attacks targeting Mongol supply lines, outposts, and stragglers. These skirmishes were designed not to win large-scale victories, but to wear down the Mongol forces, demoralize them, and throw them off balance. Tran Hung Dao's forces knew when to fight and when to retreat, always leaving the Mongols uncertain about where the next attack would come from. They employed hit-and-run tactics that kept the Mongols on edge, constantly moving and unable to rest. The Vietnamese soldiers, using their superior knowledge of the local environment, would strike quickly, then vanish into the forests or mountains before the Mongols could retaliate. This constant pressure, combined with the physical and psychological strain of the never-ending raids, began to take its toll on the Mongol forces. The Vietnamese also capitalized on the geography of their land, using it as an active participant in the defense. Tran Hung Dao, understanding the importance of waterways and terrain, orchestrated battles in locations that heavily favored the Vietnamese. Rivers, swamps, and dense jungles became the Vietnamese army's allies, making it nearly impossible for the Mongols to maintain their traditional advantage of speed and maneuverability. One of the most important aspects of Tran's strategy was his ability to draw the Mongols into unfavorable positions, where their numerical superiority would count for little. But the most significant moment in this renewed struggle came in 1285, when the Vietnamese set a trap for the Mongols that would forever alter the course of the campaign. The Mongols, confident in their overwhelming numbers, continued to push forward into the heart of Dai Viet. Tran Hung Dao, however, had anticipated their movements. He had carefully observed the Mongol strategy, and now he had an opportunity to strike. He positioned his forces strategically in a narrow, water-bound valley, where the Mongols would be forced into a confined space perfect for an ambush. As the Mongol army advanced, they unknowingly walked right into Tran's carefully laid trap. When the Mongols entered the valley, the Vietnamese forces sprang into action, using hidden stakes beneath the water's surface. Tran Hung Dao's army caused the Mongol fleet to become impaled on sharp, iron-tipped poles. This unexpected tactic was a crushing blow to the Mongol forces, whose ships, usually a symbol of their unmatched military power, were now helplessly trapped and destroyed. The Vietnamese, using their intimate knowledge of the waterways, attacked swiftly, catching the Mongols by surprise and causing massive losses. The Battle of Bach Dang River, as it would later be called, was the turning point in the 1285 invasion. It was a devastating blow to the Mongol forces, who had expected little resistance. The defeat shattered the Mongol fleet and forced Kublai Khan to rethink his strategy. The loss was not just tactical, it was psychological. The Mongols had never encountered such fierce resistance. In all their previous campaigns, the Vietnamese, despite being smaller in number and facing an overwhelmingly powerful enemy, had once again shown the Mongols that their conquest of Dai Viet would not be easily achieved. Following the defeat at Bach Dang River, the Mongols were forced into a retreat. The victory was a testament to the brilliance of General Tran Hung Dao's leadership and his ability to adapt the Mongols' own tactics against them. The Vietnamese, using guerrilla warfare, traps, and their deep knowledge of the terrain, had turned the tide of the invasion and forced the Mongols to retreat in disgrace. The victory not only proved the resilience of the Vietnamese people, but also marked the beginning of the end for Mongol ambitions in Southeast Asia. The Mongols returned to Dai Viet in 1285 with a much larger and better equipped force, but despite their overwhelming numbers, they were once again undone by the brilliance of Tran Hung Dao's strategies. The Mongols, who had conquered vast territories across Eurasia, had underestimated the tenacity and ingenuity of the Vietnamese. Tran Hung Dao's leadership, the guerrilla tactics employed by the Vietnamese forces, and their intimate knowledge of the land had allowed them to defeat the Mongols once again. This second invasion would ultimately prove to be the final Mongol attempt to subjugate Dai Viet. The Mongol forces, humbled by their losses, would retreat back to China, marking the end of their imperial ambitions in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese had shown that, despite the odds, they could stand up to one of the most powerful empires in history. The victory was not just a military one. It was a testament to the resilience of the Vietnamese people, who, against all odds, had proven that their land was not for the taking. The Mongols had learned the hard way that no matter how great the empire, there was always a limit to its reach, and that limit had been reached in Dai Viet. The Mongols, having suffered a humiliating defeat during their first invasion of Dai Viet in 1258, were far from willing to abandon their ambitions in Southeast Asia. Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor, was not one to accept failure, and by 1285 he had assembled an even larger and more formidable force to reassert Mongol dominance over the region. This time, the Mongol army was accompanied by an impressive fleet, ready to secure victory through their powerful naval forces, which had helped them conquer much of China and other territories. Confident in their overwhelming numbers and advanced weaponry, the Mongols believed that they would crush the Vietnamese resistance with ease. But what the Mongols did not fully understand was that the Vietnamese were no longer the same people they had faced nearly 3 decades ago. Under the expert leadership of General Tran Hung Dao, the Vietnamese had honed their skills in guerrilla warfare, using their knowledge of the land and its terrain to their advantage. They had learned from their previous experience, refining their strategies and waiting for the right moment to strike. Tran Hung Dao, one of the most brilliant military minds in Vietnam's history, understood that while the Mongols were strong, their greatest weakness lay in their inability to adapt to the difficult terrain of Dai Viet. The Mongols advanced deep into the heart of the kingdom with their usual confidence, but the Vietnamese knew that direct confrontation on open ground would be disastrous. They needed to outsmart the Mongols once again. The Vietnamese forces retreated strategically, drawing the Mongols further into their territory, where they could set the perfect trap. They understood the importance of the waterways that flowed through Dai Viet rivers that would prove crucial in the final confrontation. The stage was set for the battle that would alter the course of history. The turning point came at the Battle of Bac Dang River, one of the most decisive and well-executed military operations in Vietnamese history. As the Mongol fleet, led by its naval commander, advanced along the river toward the heart of Dai Viet, they were unaware of the trap that had been meticulously set by Tran Hung Dao and his forces. The Vietnamese had anticipated the Mongol fleet's approach, knowing that the mighty ships, designed for speed and firepower, would be a formidable force. But they also understood the importance of timing and terrain, and they used that to their advantage. Tran Hung Dao had ordered his men to plant sharp, iron-tipped stakes just below the surface of the river, at a location where the tide was known to fluctuate. At high tide, the stakes would be submerged, and the Mongol fleet would sail right over them, unaware of the danger lying beneath. But as the tide receded, the stakes would be revealed, creating an impenetrable field of sharp poles that could easily impale any ship attempting to pass through. The Vietnamese forces waited in the shadows, their hearts filled with a mix of anticipation and confidence. They knew that the fate of their kingdom rested on this moment. When the Mongol fleet, with its imposing ships, finally reached the designated area of the river, the tide was at its highest. The Mongols, completely unaware of the trap, sailed confidently toward what they believed would be an easy victory. Then, as the tide began to recede, disaster struck for the Mongols. The submerged stakes became visible, and the Mongol ships, unable to navigate the treacherous waters, were trapped. The sharp stakes tore into the hulls of the ships, impaling them and leaving the fleet helpless. The Mongols, known for their naval superiority, were now completely vulnerable. Panic spread through their ranks as they realized they had been outmaneuvered by the Vietnamese forces, who had used the land and the river against them in a brilliant stroke of strategy. Tran Hung Dao's forces, lying in wait, then launched their attack. With the Mongol fleet incapacitated, the Vietnamese forces descended upon the disoriented Mongol troops with ferocity. The Mongols, already shaken by the destruction of their fleet, were now fighting on unfamiliar ground, struggling to maintain their composure. The tide had turned in favor of the Vietnamese, who, though outnumbered, had proven that they could outthink and outmaneuver the Mongols on their own turf. The Battle of Bac Dang River became a symbol of Vietnamese ingenuity and determination. It was a masterstroke of military strategy that demonstrated the power of knowledge and preparation over brute force. The Vietnamese, by exploiting the natural geography of their homeland, had not only defeated the Mongols on the water, but had also shattered their confidence. The Mongols, accustomed to overwhelming victories across the vast territories they controlled, were now forced to reckon with the reality that they had met their match in the fierce resistance of the Vietnamese. The Mongol retreat following the defeat was swift and humiliating. Kublai Khan, who had believed that Dai Viet would fall easily, now found himself on the defensive. His forces had been decisively beaten by a smaller, less technologically advanced army that had used its knowledge of the land and terrain to its advantage. The Battle of Bac Dang River was a turning point in the Mongol Empire's campaign in Southeast Asia. The defeat marked the end of their attempts to conquer Dai Viet, and the Vietnamese victory sent a clear message: no matter how powerful the invader, the strength of a determined people, fighting for their land and their freedom, could not be easily defeated. The victory at Bac Dang River was not just a military triumph. It was a symbol of resilience, unity, and strategy. The Vietnamese had proven that they were more than capable of defending their homeland against one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. They had outsmarted the Mongols at their own game, and in doing so they secured their place in history as a nation that would not be conquered. For the Mongols, the Battle of Bach River was a painful reminder that even the mightiest empire could be brought low by the ingenuity and determination of a small, resourceful nation. It was the end of Mongol attempts to subdue Dai Viet, and the beginning of a new era of independence and resilience for the Vietnamese people. The lesson was clear: no empire, no matter how vast, could ever conquer the spirit of a people who were willing to fight for their freedom and their land. The Battle of Bach River in 1285 had delivered a crushing blow to the Mongol Empire's ambitions in Southeast Asia. The Mongol fleet, once a symbol of unparalleled naval power, was left shattered and humiliated, unable to recover from the devastating losses inflicted by the Vietnamese forces. The brilliance of General Tran Hung Dao and his tactical mastery had proven to be too much for the Mongols, whose superiority in numbers and military technology was rendered useless by the fierce guerrilla tactics and deep knowledge of the local terrain employed by the Vietnamese. In the wake of this monumental defeat, the Mongols found themselves not only retreating, but questioning their own strategies. For an empire that had swept across vast regions from the steppes of Mongolia to the heart of Europe and China, this failure was a blow to their pride and their reputation. For the first time in decades, they had encountered an enemy they could not defeat, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. The Vietnamese, despite their smaller numbers and lack of sophisticated weaponry, had demonstrated an indomitable spirit and a strategic brilliance that the Mongols had not anticipated. They had been outplayed on their own terms, and the humiliation was palpable. After their crushing defeat at Bach River, the Mongols, frustrated and overstretched, found themselves in a precarious position. Kublai Khan, who had once seen the conquest of Vietnam as a mere formality, now had to grapple with the reality that his ambitious plans to dominate Southeast Asia were slipping away. The defeat in Dai Viet had not only stalled the Mongol expansion, but had also shaken the confidence of the Mongol leadership. What was once thought to be a relatively simple conquest had turned into a quagmire, and the Mongols found themselves unable to salvage their mission. Despite their defeat, Kublai Khan was not one to admit failure easily. He attempted to negotiate with the Vietnamese, hoping to salvage some form of tribute or submission. However, the Vietnamese, emboldened by their victory, were no longer willing to entertain such offers. The humiliation of the Mongol retreat was still fresh in the minds of the Vietnamese people, and they were resolute in their desire to remain independent. Tran Hung Dao's victory had cemented the Vietnamese resistance as a symbol of national pride, and the Mongols now found themselves facing a united, determined foe who would not be swayed by diplomatic overtures. But the Mongols were not only distracted by their inability to conquer Dai Viet, they were also facing increasing internal turmoil. The Mongol Empire, which had once been a well-oiled machine under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, was beginning to show signs of disarray. Kublai Khan, who had led the empire to great heights, was now dealing with a brewing power struggle within his own family and the court. The death of his brother, the famed General Kublai, and the subsequent succession crises that followed, weakened the centralized power structure of the Mongol leadership. These internal struggles, compounded by the failure to subdue Dai Viet, diverted Kublai Khan's focus away from Southeast Asia. Rather than consolidating his power and pursuing his ambitions of conquering Vietnam, he was now forced to turn his attention inward, dealing with political rivalries and the fracturing unity of his empire. The Mongols' failure in Vietnam was not just a military setback, but a symbolic loss, one that revealed the limitations of their empire and the challenges of maintaining control over such vast and diverse territories. Kublai Khan's attempts to negotiate were further undermined by the growing unrest among the Mongol nobility and the challenges of governing a sprawling empire. His ambitious plans of expansion in the south were becoming increasingly untenable, as his focus was now diverted by the domestic challenges within the empire. The administrative structure of the Mongol state, which had once been effective at managing its territories, was beginning to crumble under the weight of constant warfare and the strain of overextension. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese, having successfully resisted Mongol domination, were left to rebuild and fortify their independence. The victory at Bach Dang River was more than just a military triumph. It was a pivotal moment in the history of Vietnam, a moment that galvanized the nation's spirit and united its people in the face of foreign aggression. The Vietnamese, under the leadership of figures like Tran Hung Dao, had proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful military forces in the world and emerge victorious. Their success in repelling the Mongols marked a significant moment of national pride and self-determination that would echo through the generations. The Mongol retreat from Vietnam, compounded by their failure to negotiate a satisfactory settlement, marked the end of their imperial ambitions in the region. The Vietnamese had successfully preserved their independence, and the Mongols, now distracted by internal power struggles, were no longer in a position to pursue further military campaigns in Southeast Asia. Kublai Khan's dream of conquering Vietnam and incorporating it into the Mongol Empire was shattered, and the Mongols' focus shifted away from the Southeast Asian region as internal strife consumed their attention. For the Vietnamese, the Mongol failure represented not just a military victory, but a powerful affirmation of their resilience and determination. The victory at Bach Dang River and the subsequent retreat of the Mongols would go down in history as one of the most significant moments of resistance against foreign domination. The Vietnamese had demonstrated that, despite the odds, they could defend their homeland against the might of an empire that had already conquered much of the known world. Their ability to repel the Mongols was a testament to the strength of their people, their unity, and their unwavering commitment to preserving their sovereignty. In the end, Kublai Khan's failure to conquer Vietnam would become a defining moment in the history of both the Mongol Empire and the Kingdom of Dai Viet. The Mongols, unable to adapt to the terrain and the tactics of the Vietnamese, were forced to retreat in disgrace. The internal struggles within the Mongol Empire only served to further undermine their ability to extend their influence in Southeast Asia, and Kublai Khan's dream of controlling Vietnam was finally laid to rest. The defeat in Vietnam would remain one of the few blemishes on an otherwise victorious Mongol campaign, and it would be remembered as a testament to the resilience of a small but determined nation that refused to bow to foreign invaders. The resounding Vietnamese victory over the Mongol invaders, culminating in the catastrophic defeat of the Mongol fleet at the Battle of Bach Dang River, became more than just a military triumph. It became a defining moment in the history of the Vietnamese people. The triumph was not merely about outlasting an invading force. It was a testament to the resilience of a nation, the tenacity of its people, and their unwavering commitment to independence. The Mongols, accustomed to swift victories, had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed by a nation determined to protect its sovereignty at all costs. The Mongols' failure in Vietnam was a rare blemish on an empire that had conquered vast portions of the known world, and it left an indelible mark on the historical narrative of both Vietnam and the Mongol Empire. In the aftermath of this great victory, General Tran Hung Dao emerged as a national hero. His name became synonymous with courage, military brilliance, and leadership. For the Vietnamese, his victory was not just about defeating the Mongols. It was about defending their very identity and way of life. Tran Hung Dao's tactics during the Mongol invasions were nothing short of genius. His ability to use the terrain to his advantage, his understanding of guerrilla warfare, and his strategic foresight turned the tide of battle in favor of the Vietnamese against all odds. His leadership was a beacon of hope for the people of Dai Viet, rallying them together and proving that even the mightiest empire could be defeated by a people united in purpose and resolve. The victory at Bach River, where the Mongol fleet was decimated by hidden stakes beneath the waters, became a symbol of Vietnam's enduring spirit. The Vietnamese forces, although outnumbered, in facing one of the most powerful military forces in the world, had defeated the Mongols, not through sheer force, but through intelligence, resilience, and a deep understanding of their land. The victory was a powerful reminder that, in the face of overwhelming odds, the will to fight for one's homeland and freedom can overcome even the most formidable adversary. It was a moment that would inspire generations of Vietnamese to come, reinforcing the idea that no power, no matter how great, could crush their resolve. General Tran Hung Dao's leadership throughout the Mongol invasions solidified his place as one of Vietnam's greatest military minds. His ability to inspire his troops and his strategic decisions, which were often ahead of their time, were pivotal in ensuring the Mongols' retreat. He did not just lead with the strength of his arms, he led with wisdom and insight. Understanding that defeating the Mongols required more than just bravery, it required the ability to outthink and outlast them. Tran Hung Dao's victory was a triumph of intellect and strategic brilliance over brute force. He knew that the Mongols, despite their military might, could be defeated if their weaknesses were exploited. And exploit them he did, turning the very rivers and jungles of Vietnam into weapons against the invaders. But the victory was not just about one battle. It was about the unyielding spirit of the Vietnamese people, their collective will to resist foreign domination. The Mongols, for all their military power, had underestimated the resolve of the Vietnamese people. They thought they could simply crush the kingdom beneath their boots, but what they did not realize was that the Vietnamese were fighting not just for survival, but for their identity, their culture, and their future. The strength of the Vietnamese people lay not in the size of their army or the weapons they possessed, but in their unwavering determination to defend their homeland. The aftermath of the Mongol defeat left a lasting impact on Vietnam and the broader region. The victory cemented Vietnam's position as an independent and proud nation, capable of standing up to the most powerful forces in the world. It also sent a message to other would-be invaders that the Vietnamese were a people who would not yield to foreign rule. The Mongol failure in Vietnam marked the end of their ambitions in Southeast Asia and signaled a shift in the balance of power in the region. For the Mongols, it was a humiliating retreat, but for the Vietnamese, it was a moment of liberation. A moment that would echo through history as a symbol of their resilience and resistance. The story of Vietnam's victory over the Mongols and the heroic leadership of General Tran Hung Dao became a source of inspiration for future generations. His name would forever be remembered in the annals of Vietnamese history as the man who led his people to victory against an empire that seemed invincible. Tran Hung Dao's victory was not just a personal achievement, but a victory for the entire Vietnamese nation. His leadership became a model for future military commanders, and his tactics were studied and emulated by those who came after him. As we reflect on the legacy of the Mongol invasions of Vietnam, we are reminded of the incredible resilience and ingenuity of the Vietnamese people. Their victory was not simply a matter of military prowess, but a testament to their ability to adapt, to persevere, and to fight for their homeland. It was a victory that transcended the battlefield, symbolizing the strength of a people united in their desire for independence. The defeat of the Mongols in Vietnam became a defining moment in the country's history, one that would shape the course of its future and inspire countless generations to come. But the story does not end here. The victory over the Mongols is only one chapter in the rich and complex history of Vietnam. The resilience demonstrated in those turbulent years would become the foundation upon which future generations would build their own struggles for independence. The fight against foreign invaders would continue, and the spirit of Tran Hung Dao and the Vietnamese resistance would live on. The story of their struggle is a story of triumph, courage, and hope that continues to resonate today. As we look ahead, we can see that the lessons of this victory are as relevant now as they were in the 13th century. The determination to defend one's homeland, to stand firm in the face of adversity, and to never give up on the fight for freedom are values that transcend time. The victory over the Mongols serves as a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, can defeat the spirit of a people determined to protect their land, their identity, and their future. Stay tuned as the journey of Vietnam's history continues, and we explore more of the remarkable moments that shaped this incredible nation.